I'm Ari Redboard, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. On today's TRM Talks, I sit down with Professor Brett Falk, head of the Crypto and Society Lab at Penn. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. On today's Inside the Lab, we're looking at crypto-enabled fraud, and the scale is staggering. In 2025, scam-related crypto activity reached approximately $35 billion, and that figure likely underestimates the true scope because underreporting remains significant. What's changed is not just the volume, it's the structure. These are no longer one-off fraudsters running opportunistic schemes. We are seeing vertically integrated scam centers with recruitment pipelines, relationship building teams, technical units, building spoofed investment dashboards, and integrated laundering pathways. Overlay that with roughly a 500% increase in AI-enabled scam indicators year over year. Generative AI has lowered the cost of persuasion. Fraudsters can automate multilingual conversations, personalize scripts in real time, generate fake investment dashboards instantly, and scale outreach without proportional increases in labor. The marginal cost of targeting one more victim is approaching zero. From a financial architecture perspective, scam proceeds typically follow repeatable pathways: victim deposits into shell entities or mule accounts, conversion into stablecoins, fragmentation across wallets, then routing into liquidity hubs for consolidation. This is industrialized deception operating at digital speed. The operational takeaway is clear. Investigators cannot treat scams as isolated events. They must map enterprise infrastructure, shell companies, stablecoin corridors, exchange exposure, and recurring routing behavior, because the network is where the disruption happens. And now, I sit down with Professor Brett Falk. Today, I'm joined by Brett Falk. Brett is research faculty at Penn. Brett, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, I want our listeners sort of upfront to really get this relationship because it is just so cool. So I feel like they always put us together. It started at Duke. We've done 2 or 3 panels where we talk about blockchain security, and I come from the illicit finance perspective, and you bring that sort of quantum zero knowledge proof, really technologist perspective. You moderated a panel recently at Vanderbilt that I was on, again, talking about these types of issues. And very, very recently, we got together and I interviewed you in sort of a more of a fireside chat format at Boston Blockchain Association. And that's when I really realized, like, we have got to do a TRM Talks here. So thank you so much for joining the conversation today. Without further ado, tell me a little bit about your role and your journey. Tell me about how you got interested in this space, academia, technology more broadly.
Sure. I mean, it's been a long while. So in high school, I was really excited about physics, and I read all the pop physics books about cosmology, and I was like, I'm going to understand the universe. And so I went to college and I was like, I'm going to be a physics major, and I took all the physics courses, but you have to take the math courses as well. And the physics courses had a bunch of lab components that I found like really dumb. You had air gliders and you're trying to measure with a stopwatch how fast things were going to verify conservation of momentum. And it was like, we know conservation of momentum. Here's a mathematical formula. Like, why am I wasting my time with this? So I kind of dropped the lab part and moved all to the math part. And so I ended up being a math major in college, and it was super fun. So I went to math grad school. And so I got my PhD in math. And my advisor was actually a cryptographer, Rafi Ostrovsky at UCLA. And so my research, although I was in the math department, was mostly on cryptographic algorithms and like the mathematical side of those things.
That's extraordinary. And I love this. And it feels like in this moment, you were studying cryptography in a moment where cryptocurrency, blockchain technology really started to make it into sort of the mainstream conversations out there. Is that right?
I was in grad school when the Bitcoin white paper came out, and we read it immediately. And, me and my fellow grad students, we all talked about it, and we were like, this is so cool, but it's like kind of dumb. It's like definitely not worth installing the software to run a miner, because like this is never going to go anywhere. And so we have some regrets there. But I sort of followed that from the technology side all along. And so I loved it when these early protocols were really based on their white papers, right? Like the Bitcoin white paper had some like real math in it and some analysis. And like a lot of the protocols that came afterwards really focused on having a white paper that focused on the technology. And so I always followed those because I thought that was really interesting.
Tell me, how did you become director of the Crypto and Society Lab at Penn? And maybe tell me a little bit more about what the lab does.
So I started at Penn in 2013, and I was doing sort of straight cryptography, not so much blockchain stuff. I was just kind of casually following blockchains. But then in maybe 2016, when the first like real bull markets were starting to happen and prices were going crazy, all of the undergrads were like super excited and they wanted to talk about blockchain. And at that time at Penn, there was nobody who in the computer science department who really did blockchain stuff. And as a cryptographer, I was kind of like the closest person there. So they would come to me and say, hey, can we do a senior thesis? Can we do a, independent study? Can we do some project on Ethereum? We are going to build these contracts to do some things. And so in order to kind of keep up with them, I had to like throw myself into that space of what was happening on the day-to-day level. And, undergrads are really kind of risk on. And so they all wanted to do the craziest stuff, which to me, I was, in it for the technology. And they were like, no, there's like wild stuff happening financially here. So I got pulled more and more into it. And I got better at sort of understanding exactly what was happening on chain and scraping data from the chain and sort of understanding the smart contracting. And from there, I ended up sort of hooking up with people at Wharton who were interested on the economic and financial side. And it was sort of good partnerships because I could say, here, I can just grab this data. It's one of the things that's so fun about the blockchain space is it's all public. If you want to see how people respond to different economic incentives, you just look at some different, lending protocols that have slightly different borrowing rates, and you just pull all the data and you can do some really fun analyses. And so I got pulled a little bit more then into the like economics and finance side. So even though my background was really on cryptography, the economic modeling was actually like really fun, and the blockchain space was like a great way to do it. So now I end up doing some sort of work in the basic cryptography, but also a lot on the sort of economics and modeling side. And then more recently, I've gotten called in to do some expert witness stuff. So this is like a little bit more closer to maybe TRM stuff of tracing. I was trying to explain what happened on the blockchain to...
That's amazing. I think one of the really amazing things about academia in this type of setting, like where else could you go and find experts on business, right, and law and society to be able to just, I went to some folks at Wharton, right, and this idea of like these university settings being so multidisciplinary for you to be able to go find that expertise and really build this is, I love that. I love that story. Tell me a little bit about the Crypto and Society Lab in particular.
Yeah, so we were just trying to do bigger things. So I'm in academia, but so much of the time when you write papers, you're writing for a really kind of small, select audience. And we're trying to think of things that you could do that are sort of a little bit more public facing and a little bit more accessible and a little bit more, have a bigger impact. And so this is, again, things working with policymakers, and you were bringing up that Penn and universities in general are great at being interdisciplinary in some cases. And blockchain is like a really good way to do that, right? That there is the economic side, there's the finance side, there's the regulatory side, there's all kinds of legal issues that come about. And then there's obviously all the technical side of things of, how they're built and the cryptography that's being used, the consensus mechanisms. And so trying to kind of pull all that together in a way that you can have some kind of policy impacts seems like really much more valuable than writing one more academic paper.
Absolutely. You are the foremost expert in the world, as far as I'm concerned, on that sort of intersection between quantum and blockchain. And there's this question that I get all the time as a non-technologist, and I would love you to at least start in the most basic possible terms. The question usually arises is, can quantum crack Bitcoin, or can quantum hack Bitcoin? Would you walk me through what that question even means when people ask it, and then maybe your view of how this thing plays out?
Sure, yeah. So what we know about quantum is that in the 90s, there was Shor's algorithm, which is an algorithm that could run on a theoretical quantum computer that could break a lot of public key cryptography. And what that means, it could take your public key, your digital signing, your verification key for a digital signature algorithm, and extract your private key. But you'd need a quantum computer to run it. In the 90s, nobody had a quantum computer that was big enough. Today in 2026, still nobody has a quantum computer that's big enough, but we're getting closer. And so there's a lot of speculation of when will we be able to build a quantum computer that's big enough to run this algorithm that we know. And this algorithm will be able to take verification keys, public keys from digital signature schemes, and extract their private keys. So related to Bitcoin, if you have Bitcoin that's on the Bitcoin blockchain, that is associated with a UTXO and with essentially with a public key or with a public key hash. And the way you move your Bitcoin is you have your private key, which is stored in your wallet, and you sign a transaction. And if somebody had a big enough quantum computer that gets called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, they could look at your public key, which is public and usually on-chain, and extract your private key and then send your Bitcoin to any address they want. And so they could steal your Bitcoin. And they could do this for your Bitcoin. They could do this on Ethereum because Bitcoin and Ethereum use the same signature scheme, ECDSA, that's quantum vulnerable. And they could do this on Solana, which uses a different signature scheme, ED25519, which is also pre-quantum, as we say. But basically, for essentially every blockchain in existence, if you had a quantum computer, you could look at people's public keys, which are mostly on-chain, and extract their signing key and then move tokens on their behalf. So you could essentially steal all their tokens.
We hear about Bitcoin from a vulnerability standpoint, less about other chains, but maybe it's because Bitcoin is the biggest, maybe there are other reasons. But if a sufficiently powerful quantum computer was to come online today, where would we see the most vulnerabilities? Is that within the Bitcoin blockchain or somewhere else?
So that's a super tough question because I said, so essentially every token on every chain is open, is fair game. You could kind of take any of them. As you know, I'm sure from TRM, if you went after something like stable coins, if you went after USDC, you could go and you could mint yourself 1 billion USDC, but Circle could basically pause the contracts also. So this is not something you'd probably go after. You might go after Bitcoin just because there's the most value in Bitcoin and it's the most liquid markets and there's sort of the most to steal. So that's kind of an obvious target. You might want to try to hide this for as long as possible because once people know you have a quantum computer, they're going to maybe take some actions against that sort of more quickly than they would otherwise. So you might try to go against things that are harder for people to see or they're more deniable. So, right, the obvious thing in Bitcoin when people talk about it is there's Satoshi's coins. And so there's billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin that are sitting in wallets where the public key is exposed. And these are coins that we believe belong to Satoshi. And so they haven't moved in 10 years. And this is just an obvious kind of easy target. There's tons of value there. I think probably you wouldn't go for that first because as soon as you go for that, right, there's huge hullabaloo. You go for something that is smaller and easier to kind of hide and people aren't sure. Maybe you broken and stole their keys some other way, right? They don't know you have a quantum computer. Or maybe you don't attack the blockchains at all. You go for government communications, which are also mostly, encrypted with pre-quantum technology. And, that's of some value to you.
Again, I do want to get to sort of what quantum resistant looks like, but really quickly, I mean, this obviously, you kind of got into this a little bit in your answer, but this is obviously something that nation states are looking very hard at also. This is not just the private sector. Walk me through what you see out there in terms of that. This is, I'm sure, the US and China and the type of space race in the quantum landscape happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is definitely something that nation states care a lot about because of essentially encrypted traffic for all of their commercial interests and their military interests. This also then kind of changes what you think your threat landscape is, because where you assume if Google wins the quantum race, that their first target will not be to steal a bunch of Bitcoin, right? And even if the NSA has some secret quantum computer, right, their first target is not to steal a bunch of Bitcoin. And so it's hard to know exactly where everybody is, because the public labs, so places like Google, have a big incentive to put out splashy press releases. And one of the reasons why everybody's talking about this now is because Google has made a bunch of blog posts that got a lot of attention, right? That they said, we are going to be post-quantum by 2029 because we're that worried about it. But, China is much more tight-lipped about it. I have no idea where China is, right? You can make guesses, but I don't know. I'm not a China expert specifically, right?
What is post-quantum look like? And what does that mean when people talk about being post-quantum? You mentioned Google 2029. And is there a world where we could live with blockchains in a post-quantum world?
Yeah, so there definitely is. So I was saying Shor's algorithm came out in 94. And so we've known for a long time that this is kind of a risk. So in 2016, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, had a competition to say we need to come up with post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, post-quantum public key cryptography. And what this means is actually classical cryptography, so that runs on your normal computer, not on a quantum computer, but that would be resistant to quantum attacks. So even if an attacker had a quantum computer, your cryptography would still be safe. And NIST is a natural group to do this. NIST has standardized most of the cryptography we use today. It's standardized AES and SHA. It's standardized ECDSA, which is used in Bitcoin and Ethereum. It's a great group, and I love standards. So they started this competition in 2016, and it was totally open and public. They said people should submit algorithms, so cryptographers should submit algorithms, and they had rounds where they filtered out candidates that they didn't like because they were too slow, or they didn't think they were secure enough, or they had other issues with. And in 2024, they finalized they selected at least 3 what they call post-quantum signature schemes that they basically gave their blessing to. And so these exist. They're available now. They're not super widely implemented, but they are around. The latest versions of common software packages like OpenSSH, or even the latest version of Chrome, will do post-quantum key exchange under the hood. And so they are available and usable. And so you could build a post-quantum blockchain where essentially all of the signatures are replaced with these post-quantum signatures from one of the schemes that NIST has standardized, or even a different scheme. And just to say, there's a lot of technical challenges in doing that I'm happy to get into, but in principle, it's possible.
I am interested in a question. I've heard things like, obviously we've seen upgrades across the whole blockchain ecosystem, right? Even Ethereum. But Bitcoin is more complicated. How worried for Bitcoin are you? And what has to happen for post-quantum on Bitcoin, essentially?
Okay, so just to step back before we get to Bitcoin, for any chain to kind of go post-quantum, there have to be 2 things. One is the chain has to be upgraded to support some new post-quantum signature. And this is technically challenging because the post-quantum signatures are much bigger. And so they could slow down your chain if you just try to use a drop-in replacement. But assuming you figure out some way to handle that, you could upgrade the chain with some kind of hard fork. And then, though, you have to get the users to upgrade as well, because for something like Chrome, you download the newest version of Chrome and you don't manage your keys, right? You've never thought about your key material when you're browsing the web. But it's different in the blockchain space where it's not your keys, not your crypto. You manage your own keys, and a blockchain upgrade cannot give you a new post-quantum private key, a new private key for a new post-quantum signature scheme. So you will have to actually make a transaction. You have to make a new post-quantum wallet and then make a transaction that moves your funds. So for a blockchain to really go post-quantum, every single user is going to have to move their funds, which is a bigger change than in the non-blockchain space. So with these 2 things in mind, Bitcoin has it worse than anybody, because first they have to do a hard fork. In Bitcoin, is in a bad situation to do these upgrades. One, because their developer community is much more decentralized. So, blockchains like Ethereum, you have the Ethereum Foundation. And if the Ethereum Foundation says this is what we should do, everybody's going to kind of do it. They don't have to. The Ethereum Foundation can't force you to, upgrade your Ethereum client, but it would be really weird to go against what they say. But in Bitcoin, there's not, Satoshi is gone. There's no one person who just says, this is what we are doing. So what that means is everybody can fight about how should we upgrade. And that's what's happening now. So there's sort of less cohesion among the developers about what you should do because there's no real figurehead. There's also a thing which is Bitcoin is really resistant to hard forks because Bitcoin's primary value proposition is that there's no more than 21 million Bitcoin. But if you hard fork, you could, as part of the hard fork, increase the cap. You could say now there's 42 million Bitcoin. Now, nobody's really proposing that, but every time you have a hard fork that really changes how Bitcoin works, it brings up in people's minds, hey, we could have just changed the number of Bitcoin. And you want to, Bitcoiners want everyone to believe that Bitcoin can never be changed because really the thing they don't want to change is that there's not more than 21 million. And in some sense, that's separate from whether it's post-quantum or not. But every time you have a major hard fork, it kind of reminds people this is totally changeable. So from the upgrade side, they're in trouble. And then they also have a problem, which is against Satoshi's wallets, that there's tons and tons of coins that basically are not going to move. Right? On Ethereum, you say we're going to try to get everybody to upgrade their wallet and move to a new post-quantum wallet once Ethereum supports it. And the people who don't, who cares, right? Whoever builds a quantum computer can steal their tokens, and it's just not a big deal. But in Bitcoin, everybody is watching Satoshi's coins. There's huge value in them, and Satoshi's not going to move them. So now you have this additional fight of what do you do with them? And so this is also a big fight. Do you say at some point that if you haven't migrated by some point, do you just freeze those tokens and nobody can have them? Or do you leave them to be stolen by the first person of the quantum computer? And that's a big fight that's pretty much only on Bitcoin.
What a wild scenario. I mean, toughest question of all, but do you have a perspective on how this plays out, particularly for Bitcoin?
I don't have a great guess. I mean, right now there's lots of infighting. Right now, Ethereum has probably the sort of most coherent plan. Justin Drake has this lean Ethereum plan, which is the most coherent sort of plan for one of a major chain to upgrade to post-quantum. And he said, we hope that, Bitcoin will see what we've done and like it so much that they will kind of adopt it. So that's maybe a hopeful idea. But beyond that, I don't really know. I think whatever happens with Satoshi's coins is going to happen. I guess I probably would prefer to just have a sunset date that you freeze them at some point. But a lot of Bitcoiners hate that idea.
We will have you on again for lots more discussion on this over the next few years, because it's really extraordinary. And when you think about this all playing out with Satoshi's coins and all these other conversations, it doesn't require quantum to have hacks and exploits within the crypto ecosystem. We definitely know that. I'd say the two most recent, although they're just in a string of years of hacking, are both attributed to North Korea by TRM. The first was the Drift hack. The next was the Kelp DAO hack. I would love your perspective on those hacks in particular, and any other sort of insights or views you have on sort of this real proliferation of hacks against the crypto ecosystem, particularly in the DeFi space.
I mean, these two hacks really stand out as being kind of amazing in that they didn't really target the code very much. So Drift, the attack was to send real people to come and embed themselves and develop trust with the Drift admins until they got the Drift admins to sign a transaction. So they never stole the Drift admins' keys, right? So with the Ronin attack, they actually stole private keys, right? Here, there was no theft of private keys. There was no compromise of a smart contract. They just developed trust until they could hand somebody a transaction and say, will you sign this for me? And the people who had legitimate access to the signing keys didn't check it carefully enough and signed it. And they signed away control, right? And that's a much more kind of subtle and devious attacks, very different than what we've seen, to have people in person. The attackers put up over $1 million of their own money to, again, develop trust in this space. Like, it's pretty wild. It's like very hard to protect yourself against that. You know, a smart contract audit isn't going to catch something like that.
Absolutely. We wrote a piece on both hacks, and I would encourage folks to read it, but it really goes deep into the sort of social engineering piece that Brett is describing here. Just absolutely extraordinary. Would go meet developers at conferences, would develop that rapport. The $1 million was an investment in the protocol, I believe. True social engineering in ways that we've never really seen it before, particularly around North Korea, that you can't send North Koreans into that situation. So obviously these are folks representing North Korea interests. They are proxies. Ultimately, when you talk about signing over access, what does that look like? How do you go from, even with a close relationship, why would they sign over access to the protocol?
Yeah, so Drift was a perpetual futures exchange. So there are admin keys, like with a lot of smart contracts and a lot of DeFi protocols, there are admins who can change aspects of the protocol. So they can set various limits, maybe they can set fees or rates. And often what they can also do is upgrade the contracts. So we often hear that smart contracts are immutable, but this is often not the case, right? I can make a smart contract that's immutable, but often I want to have the ability to upgrade the contract when new technology happens or when I discover some changes. And so then there'll be admin keys who have the ability to change the way the contract functions or even upgrade it entirely. In this case, right, so there's a group of people at Drift who have the signing keys, who have the authority to upgrade their contracts. And when you interact with the blockchain, whether you're an individual or you're an administrator, there's this kind of a separation. The keys give you the power to sign the transactions, but often you don't know exactly like what you should be signing. And this is like where you have a Web3 front end. So if you were going to go trade on Uniswap, you have a wallet like MetaMask, and in your wallet is your private key, which can sign things. But what do you sign if you want to trade on Uniswap? Right, that has to be a very specific transaction that's crafted to look just right to Uniswap. So what do? You go to the Uniswap app and you put in, I want to trade ETH for USDC, and you press a button, and Uniswap will give you the transaction and say, hey, sign this. And the transaction's not valid until you sign it. And ideally, you should check that you are signing the right thing. Because if you are signing something else, you might be signing, send all of my USDC to North Korea, right? Because your wallet may or may not be very smart, right? Your wallet just has a key in it, and the dumbest wallets will just sign anything that you ask it to sign. And you get something that you're going to sign from somebody who you trust. In this case, maybe it's the Uniswap app, or maybe it's somebody else who said, here's the transaction I'd like you to sign.
Really extraordinary to combine that sort of real expert social engineering piece with the technology piece. Kelp was different. Walk me through the Kelp DAO hack a little bit in terms of your take. First of all, the Drift hack was for about 285 million. Kelp, very, very similar. I believe that one was for 292 million. So really literally back-to-back hacks totaling about 300 million each, which puts North Korea, over 600 million for the year already. Talk to me a little about the differences, because I think to have these hacks come in this sort of back-to-back way, but have them be as different, really shows the diversity of North Korea's playbook right now.
So Kelp, at its core, was kind of a bridge hack. And so bridges have always been a target, because the way most blockchain bridges work is that you have two blockchains that want to talk to each other, but blockchains really can't talk to each other. So you have somebody who sits in the middle who reads from one chain and pushes messages to the other side. And the way most things work, like if I want to get Bitcoin onto Ethereum, there's no way to actually get real Bitcoin onto Ethereum. So what happens is somebody will custody Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network, and there'll be a relayer in the middle who says, I see that this Bitcoin is custodied, and I will tell Ethereum to mint a derivative token, like a wrapped Bitcoin that can be traded on the Ethereum blockchain. And this can move around freely. And when you want to go back, you will send the wrapped Bitcoin back to be burned, and then the relayer in the middle will release the underlying Bitcoin that's held in custody. So most of bridges work in this way, that there's like a custody and mint model. You custody the underlying token and you mint a wrapped version on the other side. And there's a relayer in the middle who has to watch both chains to make sure that they are in sync, that the number of wrapped Bitcoin in circulation matches the number of Bitcoin held in custody, or whatever token you are bridging.
As someone who spends really full time looking at these types of issues on chain, it must be just extraordinary to realize just how much time North Korea is spending on this playbook.
It is crazy, but I mean, the amount of money is also crazy. You never see thefts like this in any other space. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars stolen in a day is just wild. So you kind of see the incentives are there to really kind of go deep. And now, again, we were talking about AI. I'm sure that they are making the most of these AI tools to think about sort of attack surfaces. And again, these weren't code vulnerabilities specifically, but even to understand the protocols enough to understand that this is a way we could attack things, probably want some AI to kind of take an overview of all of the thousands of DeFi protocols out there and say which ones look like the most vulnerable to, this type of attack.
Well, that's also what's so scary to me, is that like you think to yourself, all right, this was Drift. These were Drift developers who were targeted. It was likely Drift was one of many, many in this pipeline that we're now going to see over the coming, weeks, months, years. That to me is staggering when I think about it. Even I was at Consensus shortly after these hacks happen. And I thought to myself, my God, like this is, it's crypto conferences where these types of engagements are happening. And it really takes your breath away. It really does.
I mean, it is terrifying, even as an individual, right? I don't have any notable crypto wealth, but if somebody talks to you for a long time and puts up some money, like you trust them with a lot of your information, right? People say they want to hire me for something and ask me to fill out a W-9. And, I put in my social security number after. I won't do it if you call me on the phone randomly, but if you spend a month with me developing trust, I'd probably give you my social security number, right? Like that you can't function in the world kind of otherwise. But so just to the end of the Kelp hack is you have these bridges like this where there's a relayer in the middle who's watching both chains. And now one way to attack a bridge is to steal the relayer's keys, and you can get the relayer to sign about things that didn't happen. But that's not what that's happened in the past. But again, that's not what happened in Kelp. Kelp was even more subtle, which is how does the relayer know when somebody is asking to burn a derivative token? Or how do they know when somebody has deposited, say, a Bitcoin to be bridged over? They have to read from the Bitcoin blockchain. But what does that mean to read from a blockchain? The blockchain is kind of an amorphous thing. It really means reading from a specific node, right? And so you call the RPC on some node to say what happened on this blockchain. And if you can trick the relayer to read from a bad data source, the bad data source can say, hey, somebody deposited a bunch of tokens on this side, please mint them a bunch on the other side, even if that deposit didn't happen. And now, again, you don't need to steal the relayer's keys. You just need to get the relayer to trust this data provider. And the relayer is going to read from some blockchain node. And so here, North Korea managed to insert essentially malicious or compromised validator software that was just providing misinformation to the relayer.
It's extraordinary to think about how different these hacks are. All right, third category of things I wanted to talk to you about today. So we got quantum hacks, and the last I think is the one that maybe is most near and dear to your heart, zero knowledge proofs, right? And it's interesting. I have found myself talking more and more about that intersection of privacy and security lately. Maybe it's in the context of sort of some of the legislation that's going on right now, how to allow lawful users privacy in an open financial system, yet at the same time keeping out bad actors. There's math for this, right? There's math for this. All right, tell me about your work on zero knowledge proofs and maybe more just sort of your view more broadly on privacy.
Yeah, so before I was really in the blockchain space, I was in private computing, basically. I was mostly working on privacy and specifically in an area called secure multi-party computation, where you have a group of people who have private data and they want to compute some joint statistics on this private data without revealing anything about the underlying data. So like a good example, that was a really fun example I worked on. I was an adjunct researcher at the RAND Corporation, and one of the questions that came up was about satellites in space. And in 2009, there was a collision between two satellites in space. It was called the Iridium incident. Now, satellite operators got worried and they said, what if our satellites are going to collide? How are we going to know? And satellite operators said, we don't want to tell each other where our satellites are, what our trajectories are going to be. And you can kind of look with ground-based telescopes, but it's not very high fidelity, and you don't know if the people are going to make any orbital maneuvers. So the people who really know where the satellites are going to be are the satellite operators. But satellite operators don't want to tell each other. So how can you calculate the probability if they're going to collide if they're not going to tell each other? And this is like a sort of quintessential example of secure multi-party computation, where you have a bunch of private data and you have something you want to compute, like, are these satellites going to collide? And you can do this with cryptographic tools like secure multi-party computation. And you can do it without revealing any of the underlying data to any external party or any trusted third party or aggregator in the middle. And you can do this. We've proposed lots of protocols for this for things like vulnerability detection. So if you think of, banks are under constant cyber attack and they would benefit from sharing some of their data, but nobody wants to reveal any attacks that would make them look bad, right? Nobody wants to say, I got breached, unless they really have to. But if you could share this data of saying, I'm seeing an uptick of attacks like this, it would benefit the community as a whole. And so could you, compute aggregate statistics without revealing any of the underlying data? And again, this is something that you can do with secure multi-party computation. And I spent years sort of developing these protocols, mostly for government applications. And this is like something that is kind of possible to do. And now, besides doing it with MPC, you can do it with hardware, with secure hardware, with trusted execution environments. And I'm currently on an NSF-funded grant right now, and we're working on building out these platforms for computing on private data, where the data stays essentially encrypted all the time, but you can get benefits from essentially data sharing without revealing any of your underlying privacy.
Is there a broad compliance application here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Obviously a lot of this is very complex technology-driven solutions that maybe governments can sort of, get involved in. But from more of sort of like we have a lot of folks from a compliance perspective who listen to the podcast, and we think a lot about how can you take as little information from customers as is useful to make a determination whether or not to engage with them, and yet not create these giant honeypots for ransomware gangs and North Korea. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. So there's one thing, which is there's always a little bit of a tension between legal oversight and individual privacy, right? These are always going to be in some tension, but cryptography can mitigate this, and you can't get sort of all the best of both worlds, but you can get more sort of from both sides than you could otherwise. And so in the early days of the blockchain space, I actually really liked a lot of the credential issuing pitches that people saw. I say, look, you can use blockchain for credential kind of management, and you wouldn't put your credentials on chain where they're kind of public, but you have a credential issuer that signs something and gives it to you, and you get a digitally signed driver's license from the DMV, and you get a digitally signed diploma from your university, and you keep these. And then when somebody wants to verify something, you could get a digitally signed credit score from Experian, something like this. And now when somebody wants to say, what is your credit score, or are you a Pennsylvania citizen, you don't provide the credential. You can provide a zero knowledge proof that says, I have the requisite credentials. So I have something from Experian that was digitally signed by Experian that says my credit rating is above this, but I don't have to provide all of my financial documents over and over to people, right? Like when I bought a house, it was sort of horrible. They want, all of your bank statements. Everybody wants repeated copies of everything, right? And trying to say you can use digital signatures and then zero knowledge proofs together to kind of reuse these credentials is like a really powerful use case now. This has not taken off yet, but I think we are getting closer to a point where that could happen. And there's been a big push for tokenizing real world assets. And if you're going to do this in a compliant way, you're going to have some kind of KYC gating, right? That you can't put securities on chain and just have anybody trade them willy-nilly. So you're going to have some kind of gating. And you can do this in a really smart way with digital signatures and then with zero knowledge proofs. And you can prove that you are compliant in some way without having to reveal much underlying data.
Terrific. I think that the conversation today is how can we enable both security and privacy, right? And they're together. And I think that when I think about it, it's like there are technology solutions to this. And this is an absolutely perfect example. Before I let you go, what do you do when you're not digging into security, on-chain, quantum, zero knowledge proofs? What do you do for fun, to relax? And what should we know about Brett Falk?
Well, I have 11-year-old twins now. They're still in an age they kind of like to hang out with me, so I try to hang out with them when I can.
Amazing.
I like to be outside, so I try to get out into the woods, maybe go for a mountain bike ride, maybe hit some tennis balls. But, there's so much going on. It's hard to get out as much as you'd like.
It is hard. I hope people see you smiling as much as I have in answering these questions the last hour or so. It is very clear that this is not just your profession, but it is like you are deeply interested in this stuff and think it's really cool. Like I am sure you love reading the latest takes, going on Twitter even and seeing some of the crazy. Yeah. You mentioned like the crazy stuff students come up with. I'm picturing all kinds of meme coin scenarios. Like I could tell you dig it, right?
My wife calls me a work extrovert, that I really do like talking about blockchain and cryptography and privacy.
That's really cute. I love it. That's awesome. A work extrovert. I think I'm a work extrovert for sure. Yeah. Brett, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. So just excited to do more of this type of stuff with you.
Yeah, I'm excited too.
It's so cool. I mentioned I've sat down now 4 or 5 times with Brett and had these types of very public conversations, and I learned so much. These are admittedly not areas of expertise at all, and I do not even play a technologist on TV. I learn so much each time, and I like sort of breaking it into those 3 areas because I think those are the 3 that I have really gravitated to him on, and that is on quantum, on hacks, and then on ZK proofs and that sort of intersection between privacy and security. And what Brett has taught me, I think more than anything else, was when I think about blockchain security, I always think of illicit finance, how to stop bad actors from hacks, whether that's cybersecurity, how to stop money laundering using blockchain tracing tools, TRM, how we leverage technology for information sharing like Beacon. But Brett brings this whole other angle to it, right? Can we hack? Can we crack Bitcoin? Can we crack Ethereum? Are nation states developing these tools? Where does China sit? I loved when he kind of to the work that the Google lab is doing. So I learned so much every time I talked to Brett. This was the most in-depth of those 4 or 5 conversations. And it's so cool that it happened on a TRM Talks. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with the team behind Dex in the City. Jesse Brooks, Catherine Kirkpatrick-Boss, and V. Lee. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. And follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.